Hi everyone. One of the most asked questions that I get is about whether people should get more critical hit chance or more critical hit damage. The answer to this is quite complicated, as it's always different depending on how much you already have of each. So in this video, I will explain everything about critical hits in great detail. I've also made an extensive tool that can help you figure out whether critical damage or critical chance is better in your situation. First of all, how do critical hits work? Every time you attack, there's a chance that you will land a critical hit. The odds of this happening is determined by your critical hit chance. When you land a critical hit, you deal more damage than you would deal with a non-critical hit. Do note that only regular attacks can be critical hits. Skills will never crit. You may have noticed that the amount of damage you deal with them is very different every time. This is because the damage you deal with a critical hit is random to some degree. When you deal a critical hit, it will deal at least 10% more damage than a regular hit, and at most 40% more damage than a regular hit. This means that if you deal 5000 damage with a regular attack, a critical hit will deal at least 5500 damage, and at most 7000 damage. The average critical hit will deal 6250 damage, which is 25% more damage than normal hits. If you have got any increased critical damage bonuses, this will then increase the entire number that rolls out of this formula. So if you have 20% increased critical damage, your critical hits will deal 6600 to 8400 damage. But this bonus works differently if you are fighting a monster that is at least one level lower than you are. Then your critical hits do not deal 10 to 40% more damage, but 20 to 100% more damage. This means that your attacks that normally deal 5000 damage now deal 6000 damage to 10,000 damage. And if you have 20% increased critical damage, this is increased further to 7200 damage and 12,000 damage. This is a very big DPS boost, however you probably don't fight a lot of monsters below your own level. This could come in handy when you are fighting super bosses such as Clockworks, the Meteonicers or Asmodan, or maybe when you are hunting giants, but normally you shouldn't be grinding on monsters below your own level, because there is a severe experience penalty for doing so. This bonus also does not apply against any monster that has no level at all, such as monsters in dungeons like the Wilds or Envy. The exact formula for how critical chance and critical damage increase your DPS is your critical chance times 1.25 times your critical damage plus your non-critical hit chance, which is simply the chance to not critical hit. So if your critical hit chance is 70%, your non-critical hit chance is 30%. Let's take a deeper look at critical chance first. In this formula, critical chance and non-critical chance have to be represented as decimal values from 0 to 1. Meaning that 5% critical hit chance is 0.05, 20% is 0.2, 61.5% is 0.615, and so on. So we have 20% critical chance, but no increased critical damage. Then the total DPS increase from our critical hits is 0.2 times 1.25 times 1 plus 0.8. This is 1.05. This means that a 20% critical hit chance increases our DPS by 5%. This sounds really low, but it is correct. As we have established, you will deal 25% more damage on average when you critical hit, but most of the time you will not. This means that without increased critical damage, you will only deal 0.25% more DPS per each point of critical chance, which is just not a lot. Gaining more critical hit chance is not a very effective way of increasing our damage yet. We will first need some more critical damage to make it worth more. Before we have that, it's usually better to just get more attack. Also worth mentioning that in PvP, if your opponent has crit resist, then they have a chance to turn a critical hit back into a non-critical hit. This chance is equal to the crit resist. So if your opponent has 50% crit resist and you have 50% critical chance, your chance of landing a critical hit against them is 25%. Now let's have a look at critical damage. Critical damage can be a bit confusing because critical damage and increased critical damage are not the same thing. Certain equipment bonuses increase your critical damage, but your critical damage is 100% already by default. If this value actually started at 0%, just like critical chance does, your critical hits will deal literally 0 damage. The critical damage stat in your stat window is labeled incorrectly for this reason, as it does start at 0%. To get your actual critical damage, you will have to add 100% to it. This is very intuitive when you have a low amount of increased critical damage, because when you only have 10%, it is very obvious that it means that your critical hits deal 110% of their normal damage and not 10%, which would be 90% less. But this is a lot easier to forget when you have 200% increased critical damage, which is actually 300% critical damage. As mentioned earlier, critical damage multiplies both your basic damage as well as the 10 to 40% bonus that critical hits intrinsically have. 10% increased critical damage does not raise the critical hit bonus damage from 10 to 40% to 20 to 50%. So which one is better? As you probably already knew, they work nicely together, and raising them both is the most effective way to increase your DPS. Both critical chance and critical damage increase your DPS linearly, meaning that the first 10% you got raises your DPS by the exact same amount as the last 10%, although keep in mind that these upgrades do get less significant. Gaining 10k DPS is way bigger when you only have 100k total DPS than when you already have 400k total DPS, but critical chance and critical damage increase each other's effectiveness exponentially. When your character is fresh, there's no point in getting any critical damage because you don't have any critical chance yet. Once you do have some critical chance, critical damage is a really effective way at making these critical hits deal more damage. And once you have that, it becomes way more appealing to increase your critical chance even further. And this continues until your critical chance reaches 100%. Beyond 100%, critical chance does nothing, but critical damage has no limit. I have built a tool that shows you exactly how much DPS you gain from either, which I will show you later. It is also worth noting that while critical chance is usually worth more to the average player, it is also harder to get. You can often choose whether you want to increase your critical chance or your critical damage further, but they usually don't come at the same values. When you are awakening your fashion with blessings, the maximum critical chance and critical damage you can get on a piece is 2.5% for both. The maximum amount you can get on an ultimate awakening is 10% for both. So here 1% chance equals 1% damage. But for pets this is different. The maximum critical chance that a pet can have is 31%. While the maximum critical damage they can have is 45%, which means that 1% chance equals roughly 1.5% damage. For weapon piercings, 1% chance equals 2% damage, as thorn cards give twice as much damage as wind cards give chance. People sometimes ask if going with crit chance is better for leveling at normal monsters even if going with critical damage technically offers you a higher DPS. The idea is that when you are grinding, what matters isn't your DPS, but the amount of hits it takes to kill a monster. And if you don't crit, it's almost certain that you will need an extra hit to finish off the kill, so critical chance would be better. But I don't believe this is true. Let's take an example in which a player has 80% critical chance and 90% increased critical damage. They would then be given the option to choose between increasing their critical hit chance by 5% or the critical damage by 15%. If they choose the 5% critical chance, their DPS increases by 3.3%. If they choose the 15% increased critical damage, their DPS increases by 7.3%. First, let's make these 100 attacks visual. On screen are 100 boxes. The grey ones represent the non-critical attacks. When these happen, the player just deals 100% of their normal damage. It is not increased or reduced in any way. The blue boxes are the critical hits. When these occur, the player's normal damage is increased by 25%, which is the inherent critical damage bonus, and then by 80%, which is the player's increased critical damage. This means that these attacks deal 237.5% of the damage that a regular hit does. So our options are to get 5% critical chance, which turns 5 of these grey boxes into extra critical hits, or to get 15% increased critical damage, which increases the damage that our 80 critical hits do from 237.5 to 256.25%. We had already established that option B gives us the most DPS. But does it also make us kill mobs in less hits than option A does? The truth is that this is very random. On any given series of 100 attacks, either option could come out on top. It is likely that when the 5 extra critical hits of option A happen, you will kill a mob in 1 less attack, but this is not guaranteed. It is possible that your attacks fall just short of killing a mob, leaving them with only a sliver of HP, in which case it does not matter whether your next attack is a critical hit or not. And the critical hit could also be blocked, in which case it deals very little damage anyway. And on the other hand, it is also very likely that increasing the damage over 80 critical hits that we already had will also reduce the amount of hits we need to kill a monster. Due to the randomness, it is not possible to measure this directly. Sometimes you may kill a monster in 6 critical hits, while another kills it takes you 8. By increasing our critical damage, we just reduce the likelihood of it taking 8 hits, and we possibly lower our range from 6 to 8 hits to 5 to 7 hits instead. And there's no real pattern to this either, as critical hits are random, so I suggest just going with the option that gives you the most DPS. This ultimately makes the most sense and should also leave you with the fewest average hits you need to kill a mob in the long run. One last question that I also commonly get is whether it is worth to put points into dexterity for critical chance alone. The answer to this is very simple: no. 1v1 rangers are going to be full dexterity regardless, so for them this doesn't really matter. Jesters can easily achieve 100% critical chance while being full strength, and knights, blades and bill posters are also going to be better off with more strength. The idea here is largely the same as in the previous example with the boxes. The 10 stat points can change one box to a critical hit that's currently not a critical hit, or increase the damage of all 100 boxes slightly. The last option is better in the long run. And it's also worth mentioning that dexterity does not increase your critical damage in any way. I will now show the tool I've made. You can find this in the description down below. Click Make a Copy to save it to your own Google account so you can adjust the values. At first glance it looks quite complicated, but it is actually pretty simple to use. In these cells here, you simply fill in your critical chance and your critical damage values. Note that you should put in your increased critical damage here, the value in your stat window. This tool automatically adds the base 100% that you already have to it for its calculations. So you could fill in, for example, that you have 80% critical chance and 120% increased critical damage. The first thing it tells you is your ratio. This is the amount of critical damage that's equal to 1% critical chance in your situation. As you can see, the ratio here is 1 to 1.75. This means that it is good to get 10% critical chance instead of 15% critical damage, but it is not good to give up 20% critical damage for 10% critical chance. The next thing it shows you is your critical DPS multiplier. This number represents how much more DPS you deal because of your critical chance and your critical damage combined. This number is not particularly useful by itself, but it is great for comparing different setups, which I will get more into later. Underneath is always the overleveled multiplier. This is your critical DPS multiplier when you are fighting monsters below your level. Here at the bottom is the pet solver. It allows you to very quickly compare all possible CC and CD pets. To use this, make sure you have put in your CC and CD values in the fields above without any pet equipped. So if we were using a 20% critical chance pet to get these numbers, I would need to subtract 20% critical chance for this for an accurate analysis. If you click on the graph, it will tell you the critical DPS multiplier that you will have with each possible pet roll. As you can see in this case, the critical chance pet is hugely beneficial at first. But once you get to 20%, it stops completely because critical hit chance has no use beyond 100%. At 20%, the angel caps out at a 2.75 crit multiplier, which is more than the crab has at that point, which is just 2.6. But the crab keeps increasing. At 35%, the crab is equal to the 20% angel, and after that it actually becomes better. Next I'm going to cover the comparison function, which helps you figure out if that 36% crab is actually worth the money. You probably noticed that there are 3 more of these boxes. These are to help you compare different setups. They can, for example, tell you how much DPS you will gain from equipping the 36% crab. We add 36% to the 120% we already had, and the tool shows us that we will gain 15% DPS from equipping the crab. You can also use it to compare very different setups. If a character, for example, has 50% CC and 50% CD, this tool can quickly tell us whether getting 50% of one type or getting 25% of both is more beneficial. After putting it in, it turns out that in normal situations 75-75 is the best. It gives us 31.5% more DPS than we have now. 100 CC, 50 CD is a close second. That will give us 30.4% more DPS. 50% chance, 100% damage is definitely the worst one. That increases our DPS only by 21.7%. But interestingly enough, 100% chance, 50% damage comes out on top for fighting monsters that are below our level. I've also made a second sheet, which is less advanced, but it also works with PvE damage, for when you want to compare DPS sets and tank sets. That's all I have. I hope it helps. Let me know if you've got any questions, and thank you for watching.